Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Conversations with History. In this episode, I am once again joined by my astute colleague, Mr. Corey Blevins, and as always, I am your host, Mr. Tyler Pierce. In this episode, we're going to explore British North American colonies from their foundation, their beginning of settlement, to their maturation. That would lead us up to about 1750. And so we're going to begin with the chronology of settlement. So the order in which settlements were created in British North America. Now, we know from our first episode that the Spanish had already settled in Central and South America by the early 1500s. And they were practicing an extractive form of settlement. So what really is the first place where permanent English settlement occurs in British North America?
You know, the word permanent there is a pretty key word, what you just said, but we're talking permanent settlement. We're talking about Jamestown, Virginia, colony founded in 1607, right? There were some other attempts at English colonization, but again, permanent's a key, lasting's a key. Talk about Jamestown.
Right. So Jamestown is that first permanent English settlement. There were other attempts to create English settlements in North America, most famously the lost colony of Roanoke.
Yeah.
And I think that one thing that's important when we think about the early English settlements, especially Jamestown and the people involved in the settlement of Jamestown, if you look at the charter for the Virginia Company of London, these were men who had been involved in the conquest and the settlement of Ireland previously. Ireland was settled and plantations were set up in Ireland in about 1604, 1605. And I think that they took a lot of what they learned in Ireland and they assumed that would translate directly to North America. They were going to show up, they were going to create large landed estates, and then they were going to dominate the local population, and a very small group of English settlers and plantation owners and overseers were going to dominate the country of really, even in Ireland, they were hostile, right? So they thought that plan for colonization was going to work. And so I think no doubt in 1607, they believed that's what they were going to do. And of course, we know that isn't necessarily the case. They had a very different experience.
Right. And I know in episode 1, we talked about how the Spanish were very extractive. You just mentioned it. There were some violent folks, and that's what they come to do. And we also mentioned in the last episode that English colonization will look different. It's going to look quite different, as you're going to mention, in like Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's going to look different in Virginia, too. And in those earliest days in 1607 Jamestown, it looks not exactly like Spanish, of course, but that extractive mindset, like we just mentioned, was definitely there. English colonization in Virginia will change over time, but in the beginning, it's got a Spanish flavor.
Right, and they weren't sure if they were going to find gold.
Right.
A lot of them wrote that they planned to meet native people and find out where they kept their gold and their silver, and then take that.
Right.
Of course, there was no trade in gold and silver on the East Coast of the United States, and not only that, but where they chose to set up their first fort. On the river system in the mouth there of the Chesapeake Bay, it had some downsides, some drawbacks, right? And in one of the readings for this week, for this module, you'll read about the disease environment and how that impacted the growth or the lack of growth in population in early Jamestown. What do we know about the disease environment of Jamestown?
Well, it's not great. Disease environment was extremely harsh on these settlers. Of course, as you mentioned, the location of the fort's going to make a difference with kind of the estuary nearby where it's the fresh and saltwater mixing, didn't allow some waste materials to flow down properly. Waste materials going to stay a little too close to the colony. So that's only going to encourage disease and make life in early Jamestown utterly miserable at times.
Right. And in the beginning of the Jamestown colony, the population is purely increased by immigration.
Right.
No natural increase for at least the first 20 to 30 years, really. No noticeable natural increase in the Jamestown population for quite a while.
Because of disease and death, and also because there weren't a lot of women present in the earliest days.
I sometimes choose to explain Jamestown to people who aren't familiar with it as a boom town. That the Virginia colony was a boom town. And if you think about a boom town in oil or in coal, what you'll see is the society is loosely structured around businesses, not around families. And that's mainly because the point of the boomtown is to extract resources and not to set up nuclear families and create what we would call like societies or towns.
Right.
And yeah, there was very little female immigration. So there are not very many women in the Virginia colony for a long time.
Yeah.
It is a very male-dominated colony, and it just doesn't have the hallmarks of what we would now see as like a naturally reproducing society with mothers, fathers. Now, there were children in the Jamestown colony, but many of them, at least half of them, were orphans because their parents were dying at such a high rate that there were hardly any children born in the colony who reached adulthood and still had both parents.
Yeah. And it also, as you mentioned, the colonies organized around business and extraction. That's going to be pretty different, as we're going to see in a second, to like Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, right? That's going to be highly organized around religion and family and kind of less about extraction, more about setting up these kind of Christian communities. That is not what Jamestown was at all.
So moving on, we can talk about Plymouth Colony. Now, Plymouth Colony is an interesting study because Jamestown had a royal charter. Later on, the Massachusetts Bay Colony will have a royal charter. The Carolinas will have a royal charter, and so will Georgia. And over the course of the 1600s and the early 1700s, almost all of the colonies become royal colonies in some form or fashion. But Plymouth Colony was established with no royal charter. It had no backing from the British government. It was completely an independent individual venture by these religious folks from England that we will call Puritans or Congregationalists. They became known as Pilgrims later. So they don't have a royal charter. They're coming over not to extract resources, but to create a society. And they are coming over to escape what they see as the predations of the Anglican Church in England. They want to practice their religion freely. Now, that doesn't mean they believe in freedom of religion.
No, not for people other than their own faith.
Right. They believe they should be free to practice Congregationalism and their highly kind of Calvinistic Protestant religion, but they're not going to allow other people to practice their religion freely. And this leads to other colonies being formed, such as Rhode Island, which is formed by Baptists who were kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies and forced to form their own colony in Rhode Island, famously led by Roger Williams, and creating the first Baptist church in the United States. Now, of course, Baptist denomination is a huge denomination, especially in the South. At the time, that was not the case. Baptists were almost universally reviled in colonial America. They were seen as troublemakers. They were seen as anti the establishment of society. They were looked at kind of like anarchists would be now. But of course, now we don't associate anarchy with the Baptists.
When the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the religious folks in Massachusetts, they were really forming closed Christian communities, underlined closed a bit, right? Their kind of interpretation and their religion was what they established there. It was not really open to challenge within that colony, as you mentioned, challenge to that religious order, that kind of hierarchy, all that stuff. Quickly got you a kick out the door.
Right.
Yeah.
And so actually we see the opposite as well of the disease environment that we see in the Chesapeake, in the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies. They actually experienced for a short period of time in the first generation a lengthening of life expectancy. People actually, for the first generation of life in New England, they lived longer than their counterparts in the old world because the disease environment was so much less deadly in New England. Much more mild summers. Now, a harsh winter, but a mild summer, and it's a temperate climate. It's not tropical. And we know that tropical climates and subtropical climates breed diseases, especially malaria and seasonal diseases.
Right.
And they just didn't have that in New England. They also set up their colonies in places that were not estuarial in the way that Jamestown was. It did not create this disease environment where bacterial diseases were a huge problem. And in Jamestown, people would die of typhoid fever and of dysentery most often. And those are diseases associated with hygiene, effectively, that there was clearly a problem in Jamestown of the mixing of human waste and water. And of course, they have no idea that these germs, they don't know what germs are. They don't know what bacteria is. Now, of course, they know you're not supposed to mix human waste with what you drink, but they weren't aware that they were doing it. It was seeping in through their groundwater, right? Yeah. They did not have that problem in Plymouth. So they actually have a much higher quality of life. And this allows for great population growth, natural population growth. They still have immigration from England, but they see a very strong nuclear family, very strong sense of community. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone's, it's almost it's almost a socialist type of idea, almost a utopian kind of idea that they're going to live together in harmony. And they believed that they were going to set up God's kingdom on earth. Is that fair to say?
No, I think it is. They're looking to set up a city on a hill. They're looking to be this kind of example society. And as they're living longer, for them, that's only more proof of kind of the blessings of God, that they're doing the right thing, that they're fulfilling a purpose on the earth to kind of win souls to Christ and to be this model of a better Christian community than the Church of England or the English church back in the old world. They see themselves as kind of the harbingers of this kind of new religious order, whatever. Yeah.
Right. And I think that for a very long time, at least until the Plymouth colony is folded into the royal colony of Massachusetts Bay, that is their goal.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the Massachusetts Bay colony, even though they had a royal charter and were governed by the English crown from the very beginning, that they also had that idea. And they were Congregationalists, and they were very utopian in their ideas. Now, these two colonies, Plymouth and Jamestown, are usually considered the two major founding colonies of the New World, right? But in the grand scheme of the economics of the British Empire, they're definitely more focused by the middle of the 1600s. They're becoming very wealthy due to tobacco production, but tobacco production has not hit a peak yet. They arrive on the island of Barbados in the Caribbean, and they try a few different things. They try tobacco. It doesn't grow very well. They try livestock. It doesn't grow very well. And then they decide to take a page out of the Spanish book and begin growing sugar. Yeah. And what does this do for the island of Barbados and really British ideas about Caribbean colonization?
So the sugar boom is going to turn colonies like Barbados into more or less one huge extractive sugar plantation worked exclusively by Black African slaves imported into these colonies. You're going to have a huge slave population on these colonies with very, very few white English people managing the colony. They're not moving, Lord help, they're not moving families to Barbados, right? They're not doing any of that. The labor in Barbados was extremely, just the environment of Barbados could be extremely tough. I mean, it's hot. It's a deadly place to be. Not founding families. No really kind of religious structure. Not even close to what we're gonna, what you would see in Plymouth. So it's an extremely extractive colony, and that's a good thing to keep in mind is that these English colonies, these are years after the Spanish. When these English settlers are creating these colonies and the English government creating these colonies, they're not just doing it in a vacuum, right? They're not doing it just because they woke up one day and thought, oh, this is a great idea. They kind of have a history with this, and they have a bit of a model to either follow or do something different than. And in Barbados, it's going to look a lot like Spanish colonization.
Right. And that is where the British slave trade, which the British fight extensively in the 1600s to dominate the slave trade. The British and the Dutch really take the slave trade away from the Portuguese. And by the end of the 1600s, the Royal African Company, which is a royally chartered company in the slave trade, is dominating the importation of Black African slaves, and almost all of them are imported to the Caribbean.
And that's only going to continue. The British domination of slave trade doesn't stop in the 1700s.
And we will get more to the specific topic of slavery here at the end of the episode. So moving on, in 1632, we have the establishment of the colony of Maryland, which was intended as a haven for Catholics. Catholics were not having a good time of it in England. They were considered to be malcontents and dissidents, and many, especially well-to-do Catholics who had land, who had means and resources, wanted to escape, much the same way that the Pilgrims did, that the Puritans did, except they wanted to establish a Catholic haven rather than a Puritan haven, and that is the beginning of the Maryland colony in 1632. And of course, the flag of the state of Maryland is still the coat of arms of one of the original founders of the state, who was a Catholic. Then we have, based on their experience in Barbados, they decide that it will be financially and strategically important to take away the island of Jamaica from the Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And they take that island, and between 1655 and 1720, it's not really the powerhouse of sugar production that it becomes, but after about 1720, Jamaica becomes a powerhouse of sugar production, overtakes Barbados. Of course, if you look at Barbados on a map, you can't see it.
Right.
It is so small. I mean, it is not a habitable island, really. It was just used for sugar production. When they start to settle in Jamaica, it's a more diverse economy. It's still dominated by sugar, but they have other things going on. They have other agriculture, and they're able to kind of support themselves through agriculture and livestock and things, and to dominate trade in the Caribbean, which was the real goal of the British strategy on the high seas, was to slowly chip away at that Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere until they could dominate trade in the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we have what we'll call the South, and that's the Carolinas, North, South Carolina, and Georgia. North and South Carolina were purely created by the whim of the King of England. There were originally 8 Lords Proprietors of the Carolinas, and they had the idea of creating kind of a model English colony. They want these to be model English colonies, and they modeled them after some other English colonies. Which ones would you say they're modeled after?
Well, some of the first English kind of colonialists, English colonists, man, that's a mouthful, English colonists to arrive in these kind of Carolina colonies are sort of transplants and Englishmen from Barbados, from some of those more extractive colonies. And of course, they're bringing that mindset to these Carolina colonies.
I think it's fair to say that they wanted to establish a mainland supply depot for the Caribbean, and South Carolina especially. Parts of North Carolina, the Cape Fear region near Wilmington, becomes kind of that supply depot, but especially Charleston becomes the supply depot for the Caribbean. I mean, they are supplying all of the naval stores, all of a lot of the food that they're eating on these islands is being imported from mainland British North America in South Carolina. And they brought their ideas about slavery there as well.
Mm-hmm. They did. And you're going to see a larger enslaved population, not as large as like a Barbados or Jamaica situation. There are more white settlers in these colonies, certainly there would be in Barbados, but you still have that idea of enslaved labor extraction that, again, we're kind of seeing in Barbados, other English colonies like that.
Right. And then finally, Georgia, one of the latest colonies to be produced by the Crown, is 1732, and it is a penal colony. Mm-hmm. It's a place where they're going to send criminals to work and support the British Empire and to work off their time in prison. Because at this point, prisons don't really exist in the way that we know them today.
Right.
There were jails, but prisons where you would incarcerate someone for years at a time just didn't exist. They had to find something to do with the growing number of criminals in England that they just couldn't support. They could not support, you have a city like London, there's tons of crime.
Yeah.
And they can't incarcerate all these people. So what they do, and we see this later on with the colonization of Australia, especially. I mean, they send hundreds of thousands of people to Australia, but Georgia is kind of the first place where they decide to start sending these criminals, and Georgia takes on kind of a identity of its own. And of course, originally slavery was not legal in Georgia. It was not legal to own slaves in Georgia under the Royal Charter. Of course, most people just ignored that. And of course, later we know that Georgia becomes a staunchly slave state.
It does.
But originally, no slavery allowed within the borders of Royal Georgia.
One thing to mention before we move on is, in kind of our American story, American narrative, we often like to look at Massachusetts, the Pilgrims, the Puritans. That's kind of, I think, in the minds of many Americans, kind of where we trace ourselves back to, right? And it's a bit of a better story, right? It's a religious society, it's families, it's something that is a bit more comforting. But the character and the look of the Southern colonies, more extractive, more slave-based, very little family orientation, right? That's not as good of a story, but that is probably a more accurate place to kind of trace ourselves.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel great with that. And again, the kind of pilgrim image creates such a nice picture for us. But the extractive, intensive labor of these Southern colonies is more of where it's at.
Right. And I think that what we see here is in history, in the study of history, which we'll call historiography, the study of how we do history.
Yeah.
We see in New England kind of a shift from a very cohesive, family-oriented, religious-oriented village structure, which was pre-modern in a way that England at the time had already surpassed.
Yeah.
That it was a way of living that even in England would have been considered an old way of living.
Reactionary.
Right.
Yeah.
And they created a society that was reactionary. It was so conservative that it was even more conservative than the old world.
Yeah. And
we have to remember that, and we're going to get there in a second, talking about the English Civil War. England was in a time of upheaval in the middle of the 1600s, from 1640 to 1650. They're at war, and then in 1688 they have a revolution, a bloodless revolution, but they overthrow another monarch. I mean, there is a lot of social upheaval going on in England, and ideas about politics and economics and society and family are changing rapidly in England. And Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony began as a very firmly reactionary and conservative answer to those problems in England.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think that the other forms of colonization that we see in the Chesapeake, in the South, in the Caribbean. Now, of course, the Caribbean never gets to the cohesive culture of the Chesapeake or the South,
right.
But we see
the heritage of the Caribbean.
Right.
Yeah.
We see the heritage of the Caribbean there, and we see these colonies moving in two opposite directions and kind of meeting in the middle, that the New England colonies become more individualistic and more based on economics, and money and trade becomes more important. And in the South and the Chesapeake and the Caribbean, money becomes and trade becomes slightly less important, and they want to create society. And that's why we see this outpouring of, by the Revolutionary period, these Southern planters, like, name them, George Washington, the Pinckneys in South Carolina, Thomas Jefferson, the founders of the nation who were Southern. What did they want to do? They made stately homes. They wanted towns. They wanted cities. They wanted to own old world commodities and goods like, furniture, and they imported tea, and they imported all these things that were making them more like the old world.
Right.
And so the Southern colonies are becoming more cohesive and more like the old world. in many ways, and the northern colonies, especially New England, is becoming more like the old world as well. But they're coming from two different ends of the spectrum. So that's important to remember. So let's move on here to big idea number 2, and we're quickly going to talk about the difference in the regions, specifically in terms of economics, religion, and society. We've kind of already talked about this a little bit.
We have.
I'm going to break them down into 4 regions. I'm going to say Chesapeake, New England, Middle Colonies, and the South.
Okay.
Right. So mainly what I want to talk about is the economics, because we've covered the religion and society pretty well. Economically, the Chesapeake is dominated by tobacco.
Very much so. Tobacco production will be king in this colony for a long time, and it's because of that we see the first large importation of enslaved labor in these colonies. Tobacco production and kind of agriculture production will start in these colonies, or start in Virginia specifically, with indentured labor, who are white indentured servants. But that will turn once there's such a huge demand for labor, right? Such a demand for tobacco, such a possibility to make money. You need more labor. Indentured servants will kind of go by the wayside, and you're going to see the importation of slaves, enslaved people from Africa.
Right. In New England, we see an economy based on fishing and shipping, and not just shipping, but also shipbuilding. Slaves, there were slaves in all original 13 colonies.
Yes.
Slavery was legal. And even when it was technically not legal in Georgia, there were still slaves in
Yes.
Georgia, because boundaries were so
Who's
kind
going to
of
enforce
loose.
the boundary?
The border between South Carolina and Georgia was effectively non-existent. But in New England, they, at one point, fishing is responsible for nearly 40% of their economy. Fishing is huge, and they were very invested in intercoastal trade. So they would fish, and that they would package those fish, and they would ship them right on down to the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the fishing trade went straight to the Caribbean for food stores, because they just weren't involved. They weren't involving themselves in growing food and creating systems of food production, because they were producing sugar.
Yeah, why produce an acre of corn when you can
Right.
produce an acre of sugar? Yeah.
And so we see a big intercoastal trade start to form from New England in especially fishing. Also lumber production. They were starting to get into lumber production, but mainly fishing and shipping for the New England colonies. And their ability to make money in fishing and shipping really is one of the reasons why the old culture of New England starts to fall apart, because it quickly changes from a society based on religious standing to based on a merchant culture.
Yeah.
That, yes, you are frugal. Yes, you still wear black and white. You're not ostentatious. You don't build a huge stately home, but you're rich.
Yeah.
And partially, a big part of it was you were rich, but you made sure you didn't show that you were rich.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But people respected you if you were rich, especially if you did not act like you were rich.
Exactly.
But getting rich became very important in New England, and some of the most wealthy colonists in the United States, definitely not the most wealthy, but some of the most wealthy. We're going to get to the most wealthy here in a second, but some of the most wealthy colonists lived in Boston.
Yeah.
So now the Carolinas and Georgia, their economies are going to be originally based on naval store production for the Caribbean, but then it moves on to staple crops, and let's just get into how these staple crops really put the slave trade into overdrive.
Yeah, I mean, as it says right there, based on rice, indigo production, very high slave use. Again, kind of the heritage of English colonization, the Carolinas and Georgia are Caribbean settlers, Caribbean kind of elites, right? They're the ones who are kind of coming over to the Carolinas, and they're taking that same sort of idea about slavery, same ideas about economic production, and we see a very similar thing in the Carolinas and Georgia.
Right, and we were talking about who were the richest colonists. They were the rice planters of South Carolina. The rice coast of South Carolina was the wealthiest part of the colonies in North America. There were more wealthy colonists in Barbados and Jamaica from sugar, but rice was the cash crop of the South, and it was outdoing tobacco, 3-1. And they needed slaves who understood rice cultivation. And it just so happens that on the west coast of Africa, they're very well adapted to rice cultivation. They knew how to grow rice. And so those slaves from that region of Africa became very sought after by rice planters because they didn't want to have to teach slaves how to grow rice. They wanted slaves who could already grow rice. And that becomes an even bigger issue for West Africa as their population of working age males who know how to cultivate rice is stripped from them and brought to South Carolina.
And we'll talk more about this later, but this I think is an interesting point to plug right here. Notice that we talk about the slave trade. Keep in mind that when Africans are enslaved and brought to New World colonies, they're not like blank slates when they arrive, right? They have their own personal history. They have their own kind of wealth of experience about agriculture, about every aspect of life that they're bringing to the New World. So in the same way that, of course, the slave trade will have a huge impact on them, they're also going to have an impact on the places that they go. They're going to, African culture and Africa is going to have a huge impact on the New World as well because of such a huge importation of enslaved Africans.
Right. And this older view of, this has been an argument within history circles since the beginning of the discussion about slavery and the slave trade in modern times in the early 1900s. Were the culture and the kind of identities of slaves erased by the Middle Passage? And early historians might have said yes, that the Middle Passage was such a terrible thing that it was so shocking to them that they showed up to the New World and they were just in such shock that they couldn't remember what it was like in Africa. That idea has been totally exploded so many times by new histories that, you go to Charleston, South Carolina, if you go now, you see the impact of African culture in Charleston, South Carolina. I walk down, Market Street in Charleston, you see the impact 300, 400 years later of African culture. And of course, in Georgia and the coast of South Carolina, you have the Gullah culture, which was very Africanized Creole culture. And so, they were creating their own society, slaves, and especially in South Carolina, because the ratio of Black African slaves to white colonists was much higher. So you might, in Charleston, in the Low Country, you might have a ratio of 9-to-1 slave to, or a Black African slave to white colonists. And in Virginia, it was much lower. It was maybe 3-to-1, 2-to-1
right.
in the most heavily slave areas. And then in other areas where it was less heavily populated by slaves, you would have more colonists than slaves in some areas.
And we'll talk more about this again. I feel like we're dipping into the slavery issue here, but I will mention that as cruel and exploitive as slavery was, and it would become probably more so over time, we'll talk about that, it did not have the power to erase the humanity of the people it enslaved.
Right.
It just didn't.
So moving on now to the middle colonies, and we'll jump back into slavery here in a second. Middle colonies were based on, the economy of the middle colonies was firmly based on cereal grain production, wheat. Go buy some oats at a grocery store now. It's got William Penn on it. You can't eat cereal without seeing William Penn, and there's a reason for that. Yeah. Pennsylvania and Western New York. What was then Western New York was only about 80 miles from the ocean, but these middle colonies were dominated by small farming and mainly the production of grain, and then also two major commercial centers, New York and Philadelphia, which would become huge and would both serve at one time or another as the capital of the 13 colonies during the Revolution, and then after, early on in the constitutional period, they would both serve as capitals. Culturally, very ethnically diverse. So far, we've really only seen ethnic diversity in the sense of, in the South, there were Black African slaves and white colonists. Well, and they were English. They were almost all English, and that's true in the Caribbean, that's true in the South, that's true in New England, that's true in the Chesapeake.
It is.
But in the middle colonies, we see a great influx of German, Scandinavian, Dutch. Of course, New York was originally a Dutch colony taken over by the English in the late 1600s in their wars for control of Dutch trade, which they do win. But we see this ethnically diverse area. And one thing I want to point out is the Scandinavian influence. The Delaware River and the area around the Delaware River Valley was known as New Sweden, right? So many Scandinavian people were living in the middle colonies that some historians have actually argued that the pioneer culture of the United States, log cabins, right? If you look at log cabins in the middle colonies and the way they were built and how they were constructed, you can trace that directly back to Scandinavia.
Yeah. And
so we don't think about Scandinavians, like you don't think about these, wily Finnish pioneers, but a lot of things they did, like split rail fences was a part of Scandinavian culture. Slash and burn agriculture, which was used in the middle colonies, was also part of that culture. And so we can't discount the importance of these other cultures other than English culture, right? And so that there is a big impact of Scandinavian and German culture in that kind of pioneer spirit, because at the time Scandinavia was still a wild place, and many places in Scandinavia are still wild places. And if you think about it, there were no wild places left in England. No. I mean, there's nowhere in England by 1600 that's wilderness. I mean, there are definitely natural places, but these people were moving from towns.
Yeah.
They were moving from farms that had been farmed for 2,000 years. They weren't moving from wilderness, right? No. They didn't know how to build a log cabin. So you have to ask yourself, where did that expertise come from? Most historians agree it's from Scandinavians. So finally, they were very religiously diverse. Quakers, Catholics, Lutherans, the Scandinavians and Germans, Lutherans, and then also some Dutch Jews who lived in New York. And there's still a large Jewish population in New York that's still there. Of course, it's been supplemented over the years, but there was a founding Jewish population in New York from those Dutch Jewish communities. And the middle colonies generally are seen as having more egalitarian society. It's based on social status, is definitely based on economics, but it's generally seen as being more egalitarian and less hierarchical than New England, or especially less hierarchical than the Southern and Chesapeake colonies.
Part of the reason for that is these are more recent colonies, if that makes sense. They didn't have quite as much time to form those strict hierarchies that we would see in other places.
Right. So real quick, we're going to go over these political ideas that are influencing the colonies. And you can't talk about the political ideology of the colonies without talking about the English Civil War. So the English Civil War, really broad recap, it's between the king and Parliament.
Right.
And you have the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The king is High Church Anglican. Many people accuse him of being Catholic. It's not clear whether he was Catholic. He clearly was partial to Catholic nobles or nobles who were known to practice Catholicism, even if it wasn't legal. Right. And of course, he loses the war. Charles I loses. He loses not only the war, but also his head. And these new ideas about politics, that they want true representation in government, that they want a press where they can write what they want. They want a freedom of religion, Christian religion.
Right.
Right. They don't want to be, and by freedom of religion, what we mean is they don't want the state. Many people don't want the state establishing a certain type of Christianity and not allowing them to practice their own type of Christianity. Now, of course, Islam, Judaism, those are still off the table. They don't want anything to do with that. Really, they want when we say Christianity here or freedom of religion, we mean basic freedom of Protestant Christianity.
Yeah.
No Catholicism, no Islam, and no Judaism. So it wasn't really freedom of religion, but
not the way we think about it.
Not the way we think of it. Basic individual rights. The idea is that humans have rights. This was something that was not common, right?
Right.
It wasn't common to think, I, as a human, have rights. There are certain things that I'm entitled to just because I am a human being.
Yeah.
The idea of rights before the English Civil War and before this revolution of thought was that you had a station in life And that station went along with certain responsibilities and duties. And your rights were those things that you were obligated to do according to your station. And that station included slave, right? So one of those stations was slave, one of those stations was king. And your rights were dictated by the station you had in life. And that goes away. This idea that all people are entitled to certain things. Of course, we know life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is what Thomas Jefferson said. Of course, that didn't apply to slaves.
No.
And that's a huge blind spot that we'll talk about later. And then also a fear of standing armies. They don't want, these people who are colonizing the United States, they don't want a standing army. They don't want a professional army that can be wielded by a sovereign to put them in their place, so to speak.
Right.
They think that the protection of the colonies should be done by the citizens of the colony, that citizen armies called in times of war are much more safe than a professional force that is loyal to the king. Right? They would much rather have a citizen army that was less well-trained and less really ready for battle, but was loyal to themselves and was loyal to the polity rather than to a sovereign.
Well, often that's all these professional standing armies as possible occupiers, like military occupying force upon them.
And then finally, we'll talk really briefly about the maturation of slavery. And so the first slaves were brought to North America in 1619. Early on, indentured servitude was much more common. So white indentured servants from England were brought over to the colonies, and they would work for a certain period of time, and then they would be free. In 1676, there was a rebellion in Virginia called Bacon's Rebellion, and it was led by former indentured servants who felt like they were not being given a proper opportunity. They were sent out to the frontier to deal with Indian raids and Native American relations, and they felt like they were being slighted because they had worked their time and then they didn't get their land and things that they were promised.
They felt like the colonial elites were claiming the best land, the best products of the New World, and they were getting cut out of the deal. Right,
and really being used as a mudsill, like a buffer between the colonial elite in the Tidewater and the growing anger of Native Americans being pushed off of their property. So they burned down Williamsburg. They effectively take over the government for a while, and it's eventually the rebellion is put down. But what it shows them is this whole indentured servitude system of labor is not working. It's creating a lower class that is going to
make demands
and is going to cause problems for the elites. So what they need is an unfree labor source that can't make demands, that isn't going to be free anytime in the future, and another thing that it does, and you'll read this in the Edmund Morgan reading for this week, it creates a feeling of equality between whites, whether a white person was a dirt farmer who owned nothing, or he was a planter who owned 1,000 acres of land and 50 slaves and a huge tobacco crop. Those two people felt like they were equal, and specifically the lower class white people felt like they were equal because of their skin color.
And notice how much this benefits the colonial elites, right? This is not that idea you just talked about. That's not an accident. Colonial elites purposefully kind of crafted this idea that indentured servants, white indentured servants, even though they might be cut out of prosperity, even though they might be slighted by elites, well, at least they're not slaves. That ideology, it benefited the colonial elites in a huge way, and that's what they meant it to do. They created it for that purpose.
Right. And so just to wrap up, and then slavery is going to be a huge issue later on, the sectional crisis. We'll just wrap up by saying that by 1700, the Chesapeake and the South were chattel slave societies where Black African slaves were kept as property. They had effectively no rights. At the beginning of colonization, the idea of slavery based purely on race didn't really exist. By 1700, that is the law in most states. By 1700, they have black codes, slave codes, and they say if you are Black, you're a slave for life.
Yeah, you were born.
You were born a slave, and you, apart from your master freeing you, you cannot achieve freedom of your own volition. No. You have no will. Right. Your will is tied to the will of your master, and that by 1700, that is the case in all of the Chesapeake and the South, and really all 13 colonies.
Oh yeah,
and that will change after the Revolution, but for now, it's all 13 colonies. And then in the 1700s, we also see something that we'll finish up with here, which is that in British North America, the slave population became self-replicating. In
Mm.
other words, there was a gradual natural increase through births
Mhm.
of the slave population, which didn't occur in any other part of the Western Hemisphere. No other colonies other than British North America had a natural increase in the slave population. And because of this, most slaves that are living in America by the Civil War are not imported from Africa.
Right.
They are second or third
Yeah.
generation slaves who have lived in the United States and, or at least in the pre-revolutionary United States or in the federal United States, their whole life.
Right.
And their grandfathers were slaves in, it wasn't uncommon by the Civil War to have 3 or 4 generations living on the same plantation
Yeah.
at the same time. And that just didn't happen anywhere else.
No.
And it caused a different sort of slave society that we'll focus on a little bit later in the course to form that was just simply different than any other colony.
Well, the natural reproduction of the enslaved population points to what we talked about earlier. Despite the terrors of the Middle Passage, despite the terror of slavery, enslaved people still, in what ways they could, try to create a life in the New World. It was an enslaved life, but still, that life could involve families. That life could involve husbands and wives, even if those weren't legally recognized
Mm-hmm.
husbands and wives.
Right.
They still attempted, because they're human, their humanity is still intact, they were attempting to create a life in slavery.
Right. And that's going to be a huge thing that we'll talk about in huge depth in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
But hopefully, given this podcast and the resources that you have, you will really begin to understand colonial America, early colonial America, and the changes in society that are leading us towards the revolution, leading us towards a break with the old world.
Yep.
And the beginning of a new world,
Mhm.
we might say. So that wraps up episode 2. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again very soon.